Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today what we're going to go over is something that'll be useful to you no matter what armoured vehicles you're going to be painting, whether it's historical gear or anything through to the far future and the nightmarish battlefields thereof. We're going to paint a tank. What I'm also going to do today is show you how I like to apply these water slide decals as soon as I can pick those up. So I've got this bad boy set here that's going to go on this Sherman in a little bit. What we're going to do is some fairly basic techniques. It's going to be washing and dry brushing as always. And we're going to start off first of all with brown violet. Okay, lovely shade of green, this brown violet. But it works great for most of the American gear. Now you'll see as well, I've got plenty of stowage on this vehicle. You know, not as much as I would like, if I'm perfectly honest, because, you know, Allied vehicles, they look better when they were packed with stuff that they were carrying. So when it comes to paint those, I'll just very quickly blast over them with some US sort of like colors. So I've got flat earth and US dark green. But for the most part, we're going to concentrate on how we're painting this tank. So first of all, let's get that brown violet on. Now this will work best if you water your paint down just a fraction more than you normally would. And you're going to apply it in 2 thin coats so that it's nice and smooth on your model. You can use the biggest brush you own, in fact I recommend it, and all you're doing is just going around making sure you've got the entire model painted. Now I started here, I've got a spray undercoat here of Storm Vermin Fur, and I've used that because the slight brownish tone is going to help us out over a normal sort of grey. So all this is going over the whole tank. You know, don't worry about the stowage and everything, in fact it might actually help you out to get those done in the same colour. But I'm just going to go around. Once this first coat is finished, I'll give it about 15-20 minutes to dry, and then I'll give it a second thin coat of this brown violet again, just to make sure my base coat is nice and solid. Now that base coat's had a second thin coat of brown violet over the top. I've done the turret at the same time, and I've given it plenty of time to dry. This has had about 20 minutes on each coat. Normally, you know, you wouldn't want to leave something that long, but you definitely need this to be set before we do anything over the top of it. Now the next step for this is to give it a wash, and to nobody's great surprise, we're going to be using Agrax Earthshade. Now there are a couple of ways that you can do this. One name that you'll hear it given is a pin wash, and that's a slightly different technique to what we're going to use today. Pin wash works best if you've given this a satin or a gloss varnish, and I mean straight over the base coat like this. And what you do is you get a smaller brush, and instead of just across the whole model, you've got some wash on your brush, and you are sort of just putting it into the recesses. Now what happens then is that the gloss and the satin varnishes that you'll find, they'll give you quite a neat capillary action where the wash goes and gets, I know, very scientific, gets drawn into all of the recesses, and it flows out a little bit easier than it normally would. That can look really good. It's particularly useful if you want a more even color. If you're doing something where you've used an airbrush and you want like a modulated effect on the edges of things, that looks really good too. I'm going to show you the easy way though, because I mean the objective with these videos is to show you how to get stuff on the table nice and simple, and that's what we're going to concentrate on. So instead of a matte varnish, a gloss varnish, we're going to go straight ahead, get myself a huge ass brush. Actually, you can go bigger. And load it up with Agrax Earthshade. Now I don't want to actually put on too much at once here. I do want to be slightly more careful than I normally would. And that is just to push down and drag it across the model. Now I will still get some pooling around certain large areas, but that's okay. What I'm looking for here is to make sure that all my recesses get this Agrax Earthshade. And if it pulls anywhere on the top, not to worry, we can fix that up. Now our wash has had plenty of time to dry, and you can see how it makes all of these recesses really stand out. We've shaded into everything, all those little nooks and crannies, but it has given us a slightly darker colour, and there's a few sort of odd tide marks you'll see where part of this is dried before anything else. Not to worry though, because we're going to go ahead and we're going to brighten that up a little bit again. Now I've got my, this is crappy old brush I've got here. These things are fantastic. and I'm going to use this to overbrush, which is similar to dry brushing, but I'm going to have a little bit more paint left on my brush when I do it. So I'll start at the top here, and I'm going to go for a circular motion. I sort of want to scrub this paint on. Now, if this doesn't cover perfectly, that's not too bad, because what we'll get instead is the slight modulation to the color everywhere. And that can be pretty cool. Now, what's coming next is another dry brush, and we're actually going to mix the color that we're going to use for this highlight. I'm going to use brown violet, and I'm going to use here, this is Vallejo dark sand, and I'm going to use them roughly 50-50 with one another. Mix those up on my palette here, and same as always, scrub most of it off and dry brush it on my tank. Now, mixing is not a spooky thing. You know, you're literally just mixing together what you need to use. If you want to use something that's close to what we're going to get, very, very lightly use Nurgling green instead. Now, this is quite green, and it looks obnoxiously bright, which is kind of par for the course for Nurglings. But you'll find when it dries, it is a little more subtle than that. So, you know, this is one to consider if you just want something straight out of a pot you can use. You want to dodge this mixing malarkey. But this is what we're going to use. We're going to go for how I would paint this. So let's go 1, 2, 3 drops of brown violet. Then give, you want both of these to have a nice good shake. And 1, 2, 3, woo! Alright, that turned into 4. So I do want this to be quite specific. I don't want it to be too bright. So let's give it bleh, one more brown violet. Okay, so 50-50, just straight on my palette there. Now I'm going to get a brush that I'm not going to use to dry brush to mix these together. And I'm not going to use any water because I don't want to shift up the consistency of this too much, that it's going to come straight off the brush. I want to dry brush with it. Just get some on your brush and scrub it into the brush. So you want it to be quite high up on the bristles because you've worked it in there. Now, a good place to see how much of this you're going to leave behind on your actual model is just quickly dry brush the running gear, because we're going to paint over most of this anyway. So you'll see it's leaving behind on the high points a nice shade of green. You might also try using green-grey for this, although that works a lot better with the British vehicles. In a pinch, you'll get away with using it for these American ones too. So what I'm going to do now is just lightly look to catch the edges of these details. So any hard points across the back of the engine deck, for example, let's very carefully, lightly, and I'm going to go around and we'll do the whole model, just aiming to catch the edges of this green detail. Now, once that dry brush is applied, you'll see it really brings out the shape of the tank, catching those highlights, and especially around the rounded edges here, you can use it to introduce some nice modulation, and I think that looks pretty smart. As a tip, make sure that when you're getting to the end of this stage, and you've only got a little bit of dust left in your brush, pop the turret on the tank so you can see that you've got both hull and turret with the same amount of sort of dry brushing on them. If they do look separate to one another, they'll look a little bit peculiar when they're on the table, but not by much. Now what we've got next is all of these little things like the, stowage and things like that. So I'm going to quickly whip around and I'll do all of those. Now I'm also going to use black-grey here just to quickly paint in the tracks. And I'm not going to bother showing, all of that step. That's just putting paint on the model. So when I come back, we'll have those stowage areas done and the tracks finished as well. Now, having painted in all those little details, you'll see that this tank's really starting to come together. Those bits of stowage, a little bit of things on the sides, and the tools, really make these Shermans pop. Now, this is the same no matter what sort of tank you're painting, so this is, I think, the stage where it all starts to look really cool. Now, what we're going to do now is go ahead and put on the decals. Now, this works the same way whether you're painting a Sherman, a Tiger, if these are kill markings for some alien Griblies off in the far future, it all goes on the same way. So what I've done is I've prepared a little bit of kitchen towel here, and I'm actually going to flood these with water. Now you'll see on instruction sheets they recommend you want to give them about 30 seconds dipped in water. but I found that sometimes, even if I'm holding on to them with a pair of tweezers, once the decal separates from the piece of paper that it's on, the backing paper, it can slide off into the water, and that's a real pain in the butt, because then you're going to go chasing it. So instead, what I like to do is get this nice clean water and just flood the kitchen towel. So make sure you're drenching these to begin with, but then anywhere it falls through and ends up hitting your table, well, it doesn't matter, you've got a kitchen towel on the way. And this keeps the backing paper nice and wet, and it might take a little bit longer, normally about 40 seconds to a minute, for these to separate from their paper, but don't worry about it, you know where they're going to be. They're not going to slide off into the water. Now before I've done that, you might see these little glossy patches on the tank, and I've actually gone ahead and given it a little coat of Millenium, which is a matte. Some people will suggest that you can use a gloss varnish here, and it works perfectly well as well. But then you've got to go ahead and put something over the top of it to make sure that it's not glossy. The purpose of this is making sure that the decals are going to have a smooth finish to adhere to, because it helps with that stage. So when that's nice and dry, and these have had a few seconds to soften up, I'll come back and show you how they go on. Now I have here some of this stuff called microset. Now this is not a 100% necessary, but I like to use it, so I'm just passing this along. You can pick this up from Amazon and what have you, really, really cheap. Normally, I mean, $3 or $4 a bottle, and I've had this now for about 6 years. Not even 2/3 of the way through. So this is a setting agent for your decals. So once this is softened and it started coming off the backing paper, get a little bit of this microset, just splash it on where that's going to go. And then catch the edge of your decal, push down with your brush and slide the paper out from underneath it. And that gives us a nice, easy way to start pushing it around. Oops. Normally I'd need about 4 hands to do this with a camera in the way, so excuse that. Now while it's still wet, you can move the decal around. And also, if you have it start sticking somewhere that you don't want it to go, you can flood it with a bit of water and lightly use your brush to sort of flood underneath, lift it up, and get it moving again. But that's where I want it to be. So now, just a quick dab, very gently, with some kitchen towel to soak away the excess. And there we have it, that's stuck on. That's going to look really cool. That'll take a few minutes to dry off and really stick to the model, so while that's going on, I'll stick the others on. Now that those decals or transfers are applied, you see how much better that looks. You know, he's ready to go on the table, almost. I think you could quite happily play a game or two with that. But we're going to go a little bit further, and we're going to do some weathering effects to really make it look finished. Now that's part of the reason why I haven't painted the rubber rings on these road wheels for the Sherman here, and it's part of the reason why I'd normally leave this step for last, because this is going to get messy. So I've got here a little bit of what is this, sponge from a blister pack that I've folded over a couple of times, and I'm just dabbing it into, this is some German camo black brown. What a name. And why I'm using this is to get a nice random pattern to these splodges that I leave behind. And then I'm going to lightly dab on these corners and any edges where I want it to look like the paint is started chipping away. Now, my suggestion here is to be fairly sparing with this. You know, it's easy to get overboard and make it look more messy than anything. But just pay attention to anywhere that you think would see a lot of impact or a lot of rubbing, anywhere that the crew are going to be walking a lot. So this is part of the reason why, you know, leave your transfers to last. You see I'm being quite delicate here, because I can come back and just dab on a little bit more if I think I need to. See? Nice and cool. So I'm going to go around and I'm just going to put some of this on the whole tank to make it look like it's seen a bit of action. Now with that chipping effect, you see how it really makes the tank look like it's seen some action. We haven't gone overboard, like I've deliberately left a few parts quite clean, but there is plenty of areas where it would see plenty of use, lots of impact, but again, I've avoided most of the running wheels. I haven't bothered with this part, and I'm going to show you why now. I've got here, this is Sterling Battle Mire. You could use any of the textured paints for this, but what I'm going to do, I'll take the turret off for a second, and we're going to take this splodger nasty, crotchety old brush into it and start just jamming this into the tracks and road wheels. Now you can be as generous with this as you like. I tend to think it looks better if you get plenty into the in against the hull. And then if you've got any that's really caking up around the wheels, just take your finger and wipe it away. It won't look perfect, but it'll help to convey that sort of muddy, mucky look that you're going for. You might choose not to paint this on. You might want to do a slightly cleaner looking tank, in which case all you got to do is just paint those road wheels. But what I'm going to do now is just bucket some of this on wherever I think it's going to look like it would cake on to an ordinary tank. Alright, now I've given that plenty of time to dry, and you can see what a horrid, gunky effect it's given us on those tracks. And up around the front here, where the front of the hull has got some sort of junk that's collected on it, and I put up a little around the back as well, just to make sure that nothing looked like it was being left out. Now anywhere that I accidentally missed a spot or put too much on, you can see probably up around the back here, honestly, I just smeared it off with my thumb, and it all sort of builds up towards that more used, grimy looking effect. So next up we're going to give it a dry brush. I'm going to start with Sylvaneth bark, then I'm going to give it a quick blast with Eldar flesh, and then over most of the model I'm going to very, very lightly go for Tyrant Skull. Now you can use any sort of colours you like for this. I like these three. They're a nice sort of mid-tone. They look like, say, ordinary dirt. But you may find that they don't quite suit the theatre that you're painting your tanks for. It's a little bit of experimentation's in order. So we'll start off. I've got one of these raggedy old dry brushes and my Sylvaneth bark. Now I don't need to worry about getting all of this out of the brush. I'm actually going to be quite liberal with it and just start chucking it on everywhere that this dirt is, basically. And as well, if I come up near to where the let's just get a look at that. If I come up near to where the dirt is going to meet the hull, I'm actually going to dry brush down towards it and get some of this up on the hull too. So it looks like that dust and dirt is collecting as this tank is driving around. And just a quick note as I'm getting towards the end of this, you can see perhaps I'm being quite generous around the front of this. And that's because I want to stipple on and make it look like, this is driving into things. So you want to apply a fair bit of pressure and scrub down. Make it look as though it's collecting towards the bottom of all these areas that are dirty, and give you something looking like that. Now what I'm going to do, having finished that step off, is I'm going to do exactly the same thing again, but I'm going to use this Eldar flesh. I'm going to use that a little less liberally. So there's the Eldar flesh applied. Now you can see I've been a little bit more sparing with it, and instead of doing it in straight lines, I've sort of gone with the ebb and flow of where these road wheels will be kicking up dust underneath the tracks. So it gives us a nice sort of modulated dirt effect, and it's really simple. Now it's not going to be as realistic as some, but this is about getting this on the table and being nice and easy. So the last step is going to be one very, very light dry brush with Tyrant Skull over the whole model. We want to give it a sort of general dustiness. But when we do this, like I said, this is almost nothing on the brush. You want to be as dry as you can get it. So I recommend if you've got an old piece of card or some some other plastic or something that you've had dry brushed or sprayed, just put aside somewhere. Have a quick brush on that before you come to this, because you want next to nothing that you're going to leave behind. But just randomly, as you're going over the model, push down in some places more than others and skip over some areas entirely. You want this to be a random sort of dustiness. And it's not going to look like much is going on at first. But as you slowly build it up, this Tyrant Skull will give you a neat modulation and colour. And again, this is really simple. This is just dry brushing. So I'm going to quickly blast around this. And we'll see what we get finished off. And there we have it, guys. That tank is finished. Now you could go and do a couple of little extra details, like painting the straps on the stowage, lights, for example, and you'd probably have an MG that you want to put up into the top here. But for the purposes of this demonstration, that's finished. And you can see the last dry brush of Tyrant's skull is so light as to be almost invisible. It may not even show up on the camera. But in person, it's just enough added dustiness. And I think that really helps set it off. Blends those decals in particular. So the important thing to remember is that before you do your weathering on any tank, put your decals on first, because that'll help blend them into the rest of the model, make them look like they belong as part of this rather than sort of stuck on over the top. So as ever guys, if there was anything useful in there, feel free to let me know. Any comments or questions, just drop them down there in the comment box. You can get in touch with me also on my Facebook or Twitter. So as ever, thank you very much for your time and enjoy the rest of your day.